talking today about Macbeth. On the surface, the literal level, the play seems to be about an individual soul entering into damnation. Indeed, that's one good literal reading of the play, but I suggest an alternative view on Shakespeare's great Scottish play. The work begins with a flawed but heroic man. Macbeth is described as brave Macbeth, noble Macbeth, fearless in facing his enemies on the battlefield. Yet he is also full of milk of human kindness. He reflects on pity like a naked newborn babe, and he seems to truly love his wife. His desire to become more powerful seems his downfall, and he enters into a job of murder which he thinks will secure him the throne, but secures him only nightmares and further murders, and further terror and violence, till he sees time as drudgery, progressing as tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, which creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. At the end, he's left wifeless, childless, friendless, and he himself proclaims that his life has fallen into the sewer, gone into the toilet. Certainly he seems to have been the architect of his own ruin. Yet Shakespeare is never simple. To understand his nuance, you need a little history. Macbeth was written between 1599 and 1606, probably 1606 is the most common date. Queen Elizabeth I, of the House of Tudor, was already 3 years dead, and her successor, James I, of the House of Stuart, had come to power on 24th of March 1603. James was a learned man, and he authored or approved several works, including the King James Bible. He was very interested in witchcraft, the study of demons, and even wrote a book called Demonology in 1597. Interest in spiritual powers and the dark arts was, understandably, quite popular in Shakespearean England. But one event seems to have figured prominently in the reign of James I and in Shakespeare's life as well. This event was in November of 1605 and involved a plot led by Guy Fawkes to blow up Parliament and institute a Catholic government in England. Elizabeth had brutally persecuted Catholics in England during her reign, and hopes of securing greater religious tolerance under King James had by 1605 faded, leaving many English Catholics disappointed. The plan, called the Gunpowder Plot, was to blow up the House of Lords during the state opening of England's Parliament on the 5th of November 1605, as the prelude to a popular revolt in the Midlands, during which James' 9-year-old daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was to be installed as the English Catholic head of state. Remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. The plot was foiled due to an anonymous letter, and at their trial on the 27th of January, 1606, 8 of the surviving powdermen, as they were called, including Guy Fawkes, were convicted and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, quartered. The gunpowder plot was seen by many as an instance of demonic intervention to destroy the holy rule of James. A treatise of equivocation by Henry Garnet, a Jesuit priest involved in the plot, was found on one of the plotters. Now, technically, equivocation is the use of equivocal or ambiguous expressions, especially in order to mislead or hedge prevarication. Logic, a fallacy caused by the double meaning of a word. But according to Janet E. Haley, this work, particularly on equivocation, was written to instruct priests sent on a mission established by the Society of Jesus, whose aim was to preserve the Catholic Church in the newest heathen territory, England. The treatise prepared priests to face the perilous questions asked of them by official interrogators, who, as enforcers of the Anglican settlement, had devised a series of interrogatories widely known as the Bloody Questions, because they could force a Catholic priest to elect between the Queen and the Pope. A rope to hang the Pope, a pennyworth of cheese to choke him, a pint of beer to wash it down, and a jolly good fire to burn him. While anti-Catholic sentiment and patriotic support of the king in England was very high, as you can tell, as is frequently the case, self-reflection and humility were proportionately low. It is therefore highly likely that Shakespeare was writing a piece of artwork which, on the surface, seems to praise authority and give to wrongdoers their just deserts. A rope. But while doing so, Shakespeare seems to have embodied in the play a remarkable sympathy for the protagonist, who might be, arguably, heroic in his final moments. One major clue as to what Shakespeare is doing can be found in the speech of the porter, Act 2, Scene 3. Frederick B. Trombley, in his article Macbeth and his Porter, notes that this scene is quickly read as comic relief. Trombley says, the scene's placement immediately after the murder of Duncan suggests that its primary purpose is to adjust and clarify the audience's response to Macbeth's deed. Thomas de Quincey reads the scene as a returning to normalcy after a monstrous deed. When the deed is done, De Quincey says, when the work of darkness is perfect, then the world of darkness passes away like a pageantry in the clouds. The knocking at the gate is heard, and it makes known audibly that the reaction has commenced. The human has made its reflux from the fiendish. The pulses of life are beginning to beat again, and the re-establishment of the goings-on of the world in which we live first makes us profoundly sensible of the awful parenthesis that had suspended them. The door warden, as De Quincey seems to point out, is the simple and human, in contrast to Macbeth's monstrous and inhuman nature. He's funny, and we laugh at such things as treachery and regicide might have merely been night terrors, something out there, something someone else does. Yet as Trombley also asserts further on in this article, the porter's significance resides in his similarities to his master. He shakily stands as a metaphor or figure for Macbeth. The ultimate function of the scene, Trombley says, is to humanize the murderer by forcing us to recognize him in the ordinary porter, and perhaps in ourselves as well. Recall that equivocation is the use of equivocal or ambiguous expressions, especially in order to mislead or hedge. Prevarication, and logic of fallacy caused by the double meaning of the word. Indeed, the porter himself cries out, knock, knock, who's there? In the other devil's name, faith, there's an equivocator that could swear in both the scales against either scale, who committed treason enough for God's sake, yet cannot equivocate to heaven. Well, come in, equivocator. In fact, this technique of equivocation, of ambiguity or hedging, runs throughout Shakespeare's corpus of work. In Hamlet, Lear, Twelfth Night, Merchant of Venice, indeed, it constitutes the art of the poet, who relies on nuances of words for his craft, sometimes intentionally leading us to one conclusion when really we ought to get another. What better thing for a playwright to do during a time of national crisis and patriotic fervor than to learn to equivocate and put his real meaning hidden within an obvious meaning, one that confirmed all the popular sentiments? For Shakespeare, Inverness represents hell, made so by the crime of regicide, and the door warden represents a porter at the gates of hell. But by suggesting that he lets into hell not just the big crimes of murder, torture, or genocide, but the little crimes as well, such as putting in cheap cloth instead of expensive, or trying to corner the market on grain futures, the porter character makes a connection between Macbeth and ourselves. Macbeth is man in extremis, that is, an ordinary guy, put into an extraordinary situation in order to observe how human nature works. He is man writ large, to echo a phrase from Plato's Republic. What happens when someone sins? Not just the big sins like murder, but the small sins such as lying to a friend or cheating on a test, getting caught up in patriotic zeal against the Pope or religious zeal against the infidel. It seems from the start of the play we have a descent from the heroic figure of Cawdor, a man juxtaposed to Macbeth, who seems heroic because he confessed his treason, implored your highness's pardon, and set forth a deep repentance. Nothing in his life became him like believing it. He died as one that had been studied in his death to throw away the dearest thing he owed as to a careless trifle. But as Duncan notices immediately afterwards, there is no art to find the mind's construction in the face. The outer face that we show to the world often hides deep, tortured elements of a soul known only to God. For God seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh upon the outward appearance, but the Lord beholdeth the heart. Duncan thought he saw a noble man in Cawdor, when behind the smiling mask of courtly obeisance lay a rebel soul. Conversely, we think we are seeing an evil man in Macbeth, and indeed we may be. But what depths of sorrow, what struggles, what fears, and even what nobility might reside within the man, only God knows. The play seeks to answer this question: what happens to Macbeth? Not just Macbeth, but every one of us. What happens to man in extreme situations? Man in extremis. Can he remain courageous in the extreme deprivations of hell, on the battlefield, in the midst of a soured relationship, facing cancer, having committed a horrible crime that he cannot fix? As Dostoevsky later notes, the crime, though important, is not the most important thing. It is the despair brought on by the crime that is. Whatever his initial motives for killing Duncan, whether for sheer power or because he rightly saw Duncan doing a poor job as king, why else would Cawdor have rebelled, or as some substitute for the barrenness of his marriage, he has no children, says Macduff. The end result of Macbeth's life is not pretty. He has night terrors, he's unmanned by fear, he's made less manly and more womanish by visions, he sees shades that no one else sees, he futilely seeks to alleviate his pain by making others suffer. He alienates and kills his only friend, he alienates his own wife. He views life as wearisome and pointless, and eventually he finds himself teetering on the brink of despair, lost in a state where that which should accompany old age is honor, love, obeisance, troops of friends, I must not look to have, but in their stead curses, not loud but deep, mouth honor, breath, which the poor heart would fain deny and dare not. Yet Macbeth is a thinking man. He considers and reasons and deliberates even more than Hamlet. His soliloquies reveal a tremendous consideration of the reasons for good acts, of the afterlife, of the power of words and images. And perhaps it is this thinking that leads him to defy despair. Because eventually he decides not to be cowed by the fears and terrors which seek to destroy him. The mind I sway by and the heart I bear shall never sag with doubt nor shake with fear, he vows. And as each assurance from the witches that everything will be okay proves itself to be a falsehood, Macbeth concludes that he has only one course to follow. Eventually he realizes, they have tied me to a stake, I cannot fly, but bear-like I must fight the course. In this case, however, the course is not just the destiny laid down for him, or the inevitable end of his diabolic actions. Rather, the course is the river of tears, despair, which courses toward him like a flood. Like King Canute, he is fighting the tide of ruin rather than submitting to it. Macbeth defies the witches who, like the devil, were seemingly his friends and allies, but have proved his deceivers. When he vows, "But be these juggling fiends no more believed that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear, and break it to our hope." Thus, during the end battle, Macbeth is not just a raging demon of violence. In fact, he checks himself from killing Macbeth because his soul is too much charged with the blood of Macduff's family. But when Macduff taunts him, saying, "Then yield thee, coward, and live to be the show and gaze of the time. We'll have thee as our rarer monsters are painted on a pole, and under it here may you see the tyrant," Macbeth responds with defiance, saying, "I will not yield, to kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, and to be baited with the rabble's curse." Even though all that had hitherto pointed to his success now is gone, even though Burnham would be come to Dunsinane, and Duff opposed being of no woman born, yet I will try the last. Well, the last what? The ambiguity of the word leads us to an equivocation. Does Shakespeare here mean that Macbeth is defiant of the will of God even at the end and thus damned? Is Macbeth's clinging to life set in contrast to noble Cawdor's throwing away life like a trifle? Or could it be that Shakespeare means that even when all good things are gone, something in man still defies despair and clings resiliently to hope? What, after all, does the enemy want from us but that we despair? Did Guy Fawkes despair as his arms and legs were torn from him? Perhaps in the mind of Shakespeare the deep damnation of our taking off lies not in breaking the commandments, but in despairing that we can ever rectify the situation after we inevitably do break them. Perhaps what the play shows us through the use of man in extremis is that to defy despair is the ultimate act of heroism. Perhaps it is here pressed upon this bank and shoal of time where we must decide not to submit to our own destruction, but actually to say with Macbeth, "Before my body I throw my warlike shield. Lay on Macduff, and damned be him that first cries, 'Hold!'